I am going to introduce our first speaker for the day, who is going to be talking to us about how we respond and how our kids respond when hard things happen. He is Dr. R.J. Gillespie, and he is a pediatrician who actually practices medicine in the same pediatrician's office that he went to when he was a kid. I know, right? So cute. I love it. He is also the medical director for the Oregon Pediatric Improvement Partnership, which is just one of the ways that Dr. Gillespie works to improve the quality of care for all of our children, with particular interest in early childhood. He's been instrumental in training physicians and others across the state on ways to screen for depression, developmental delays, substance abuse, autism, and maternal depression. And he's currently working on screening for parental adverse childhood experiences, which you'll learn more about in a minute. And he's been recognized nationally for this work, which is what he'll be talking with us about today. So please welcome Dr. Gillespie.
Good morning, and thank you for the invitation to come speak with you today. This is an issue that I feel very passionately about, and I do feel that, again, in terms of busting stigma, this is something that all pediatricians should be talking about, although very few of us at the moment are. I'm going to talk first about what adverse childhood experiences are. I'm going to talk a little bit about why I think parents' adverse childhood experiences matter and tell you some stories of just visits that I've had where I feel like they were affected by a parent's history, and then talks about some very concrete things that I think you could start doing really the next time you see your kid. Okay? So adverse childhood experiences, this came out of a study that's just about 20 years old now. It actually was published in 1998. And it was a guy in Kaiser, an adult medicine doctor, who was looking at how early childhood trauma could affect health and wellness for the rest of the lifespan. And he found that of these 10 experiences that are listed on the screen, if you had a lot of these, that you had much bigger challenges, both in terms of your health and in terms of your mental health. And the 10 experiences that he found to be most powerful were physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, physical and emotional neglect, and then household problems, a family member that had mental illness or substance abuse problems, domestic violence within the household, divorce, separation, or loss of a parent, and having a relative in jail. And he found that the more of these experiences you had, the higher your risk would be for certain, again, mental health and physical health problems. What's important to know, though, is he found that adverse childhood experiences, or these early childhood traumas, were extremely common, and that about 2/3 of the people that he surveyed had at least one of these experiences in their history. 40% had 2 or more, and 12.5% had 4 or more. So if of all of us in the room, most of us have had some of these experiences. So the people sitting next to you, me, standing in front of you, a lot of people have had these histories. In Oregon, these estimates are even a little higher. So it's actually estimated in Oregon that about 17% of adults living in Oregon have had 4 or more of these adverse childhood experiences. So it's not a few of us, it's a lot of us, right? When you add in other types of trauma, that gets even more common, that we've experienced other traumatic, difficult things in our childhood. And these can include bullying, racism or prejudice, living in a community that experiences violence on a regular basis. Immigrants and refugees often have experienced extreme trauma in the places that they've come from. Medical trauma, so the things that we do as providers can be traumatic to children, obviously, especially if you've had some complicated medical problems, then hospitalizations and procedures and all those sort of things can be traumatic as well. And then natural disasters, if you happen to be unfortunate enough to live where there are hurricanes or earthquakes or other things, that these can also be traumatic experiences as well. How does that affect parenting? And I think there are a number of different ways that that can affect parenting. First of all, sometimes there's no effect on parenting, right? Sometimes we have these experiences, we have good coping strategies, we have people around us who care for us, and we're able to overcome these experiences without any sort of effect on our parenting at all. But if you think about who our role models were for our parenting skills, and you think about the types of traumas that we're talking about, physical and emotional abuse and neglect, right? If our role models were not great, what do we know about parenting, right? Because what we know about parenting really comes from how we were parented ourselves. That's probably our most direct experience. So if those role models were not great, then we may have a little bit of a difficulty understanding what would be good parenting techniques. Second of all, if we've experienced a lot of these traumas, we refer to relational health, so the way that we interact or relate to other people, that could be damaged. So if we had some of these early childhood traumas, if we were physically abused, if we were bullied, if we experienced racism or prejudice, then how do we relate to other people? Do we naturally trust other people? Do we naturally believe that other people have our back? And if that relational health affects how we relate to our children, then certainly that can affect our parenting as well. And finally, if we have these things in our history, again, many things that we deal with on a day-to-day basis in terms of being parents can be triggering. And how do we cope with those particular stresses if we've had those kind of experiences in our past? So in my clinical work, what we've been looking at is really trying to identify parents who've had adverse childhood experiences or early childhood traumas, and try to relate that to how they're doing their parenting currently. Now, I don't personally have children. I've been told it's stressful. But I think there are certain times during a child's life that are more stressful than the usual, right? So some examples of that would be when children are having tantrums. If you have a baby with colic, when you're trying to get through toilet training or sleep training, if you have kids that hit or bite, which is virtually all toddlers at some point. Are those going to be more stressful times? Absolutely. Now, if a parent has those experiences in their past that were traumatic, do those stressful moments trigger their own fight or flight response? And can we actually prepare parents for those inevitable stressful moments so that their reactions can be something that's more grounded and more constructive for helping get through those behaviors? I think furthermore, if a parent has experienced trauma, do they have good experience and good knowledge and skills for how to take care of themselves, for how to identify when they need help, how to model appropriate conflict resolution, how to do discipline that really is relevant to the child's developmental stage? Or do you even know how to play with your child if you weren't played with yourself when you were little? In other words, can we teach parents and children to be more resilient, to have better coping strategies, and to be able to deal with those sort of stresses that come along on a daily basis? So what do we do? First of all, I think that the most important intervention for a provider to do is to listen. In my experience, when these kinds of traumas are in somebody's past, being able to tell your story in a safe space is really the most important thing for healing, right? So as a provider, one of the things that I'm most interested in doing is giving people that space so that if you have a story that you need to tell, that you can do that in my office and you can be safe and not judged. And this quote from Maya Angelou, you've probably seen this before, but I love this because it really embodies what I'm trying to be. I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel, right? And so in my office, I want people to feel safe. I'm going to give you a few stories again, just to kind of illustrate the kinds of interactions that I think are relevant to this. And so, first of all, talking about a kid with colic. So this is, when we do our screening for parent ACEs, it's at the 4-month visit. So that's when I'm really learning about parents' history in a little bit more detail. So at this 4-month visit, the mom's primary concern is colic. So the kid actually spends 3 or 4 hours every night crying. It's a fairly common thing if you have a colicky kid, right? Now, when I get into the history a little bit, it's a 2-parent household, so there's a 7-year-old sister at home. Mom's working full-time, but dad's a firefighter or training to be a firefighter. And so the way that schedule works is he's at the station for 48 hours, then he's home for 24, and then he's gone for 48. And so this mom is more or less functioning as a single mom most of the time, right? So her routine was to leave work, immediately drive through traffic, which not at all stressful around here these days, right? To try to get home to relieve the nanny. So the kid is otherwise healthy, he's just crying a lot. Now, when I go through her history in terms of her trauma, she has an ACE score of 5, so that meant she had 5 of those experiences that I listed on that first slide. So her parents went through a really rough divorce where there was a lot of yelling, there was a lot of fighting, there was verbal abuse. Mom was abused a few times. So she had this mother had witnessed her own mother experiencing domestic violence. There was substance abuse going on in the household. And so when she had a yelling child after having grown up in a house that was full of yelling, it was triggering for her, right? Because it was reminding her of all that yelling that happened when she was a kid. And so she obviously would get stressed. And so if you know anything about how kids respond to us, if we're stressed, they kind of freak out a little bit more, right? So the mom was getting in this cycle where she was upset based on the kid crying. The kid got more upset because mom was upset, and it was a loop. It was an endless loop. Now, the conversation that I ended up having with her really focused on resilience. So what are the things that she can do to take care of herself so that she had better coping strategies? And before the baby was born, she was really into yoga, but it was one of those things that with her schedule currently and with having a new baby at home, she wasn't able to do that anymore. So her coping strategies in terms of the things that she did to take care of herself, really there weren't any that she was doing, right? So we started talking about, how do you get back to some kind of mindfulness activity, some kind of activity where you can purposefully take care of yourself and your own needs. And she said, there's no time for a yoga class, right? Like the way the schedule's going, that's not gonna happen. But what we agreed to is that 15 minutes a day, where on her way home from work before she got to the nanny, she figured it was no big deal if she spent another 15 minutes before she got home, she would stop and have a cup of tea. And that was it. Right? So she had 15 minutes in her day where she was purposely thinking of her own needs and thinking of her own stress and how she was going to manage that. Now, when she got back at the 6-month visit, the crying was a little better, but not a ton yet. But mom's stress level was much better because she had understanding of how her own stress could affect her kids' behavior. And so her perceptions of things were improved as well. Partly, I think that's giving voice to the idea that, if I grow up in a yelling household, having a kid who yells makes me think of that. Once she kind of thought through that process, she was able to see some of the differences, that this isn't really somebody who's verbally abusing her, right? It's a kid who cries, and that's completely different. So for me, I think the punchlines in terms of the conversation, the first is that I think most parents need some kind of permission or some kind of space to be able to do self-care, because it's not something that's naturally thought of, right? When you have a kid, you think that all of your attention has to go towards taking care of that child, and you forget to put your own oxygen mask on first. So you remember that analogy from the airplane, right? So what do they say if they're talking about a safety briefing on an airplane? Put your own oxygen mask first before taking care of others. And I think that's really an important thing to think about with parenting, is that you're putting on your own oxygen mask, that you're taking care of yourself, right? And sometimes when you're in the throes of parenting, you may not be completely aware of how your own experiences affect how you handle parenting, stress, or your work-life balance. Second story, and this is another fairly common scenario, right? This was a kid who, it was a second-time child. So the first child, we weren't doing any kind of ACE screening. So when she had her second child was the first time that we really talked about this history, right? And so mom fills out the form, and when she talks through her history, it turns out that her own mom left the scene when she was about 2 years old. So she was abandoned, in her own words, by her mother. Her father then experienced some substance abuse and depression. And so one of the things I always ask parents is, how do you think these experiences affect how you parent now? And her response actually went back to her 2-year-old. And she said, do you remember how you told me to let my first son cry it out when he wouldn't sleep? I couldn't do it because I felt like I was abandoning him the way that my mom abandoned me. Okay? And as soon as she said those words, she was like, that's not really what's happening, though, is it? And so we were able to talk about other ways to do sleep training. So what was mom comfortable with, right? What's her limit? What can she tolerate, in terms of crying at night, and what can she not? How do we also get dad involved to kind of be an anchor in that situation so that he had a completely different perspective on sleep training? So again, once mom said those words about her fears out loud, she felt very differently about it. She said, that's not actually what's happening, is it? And I never had really thought through how that past experience was making me take care of my child now, or how that was affecting how I was taking care of my child now. So I think, to me, drawing the connection between the thinking brain and the feeling brain is really the first step towards healing. And I have to say, you're going to be hearing from some parents in a little bit, and I think that the process of sitting up in front of a group and telling your story is extremely challenging. And so I have a lot of respect for these parents to be able to do that. That said, when you're able to put words to your story and to your experience, they stop having as much power over you. And so I always think that, again, that's why I want to have that safe space in my office where people can tell their stories if they need to, because they become a little less emotional and a little less charged when you're able to tell your story and really put words to what happened to you. And for me as a pediatrician, I think too that, we make a lot of judgments about when we give advice and it doesn't work, like why that happened. That there's this whole terminology of parents who are not compliant, right? Which really isn't the case at all, right? There's always a reason behind why our advice doesn't work. It's just that we haven't dug out the why yet. So for me, it was a good personal experience to kind of shift that frame a little bit for me. Now, this is another mom who's a little bit more recent, and she wasn't somebody that I had screened for ACEs, but we had the conversation about ACEs because I think it was really impacting the way that she was relating to her child. And this is a mom of a 4-year-old, and her main concern is about behavior. And she said that whenever she tried to do a discipline for a behavior, he would giggle. So there would be this little kind of laugh that would come out anytime she asked him to not do something or to stop a particular thing. And as she's describing this to me, I can see her face turning red, and I can see the veins starting to pop out of her neck, and she's getting visibly angry during the conversation. And I asked Mom, why do you think he's laughing? And she said, I don't know, it is just so frustrating, and he is so stubborn, and it's so hard to have him laughing at me. And when I started going through the history, it turns out that she had had a lot of verbal abuse herself, and so she felt like during her childhood that she had been frequently humiliated by people around her, right? So when she saw her kid laughing, that reminded her of being humiliated by people around her, right? So this might be something that happens if you were bullied a lot, or, again, in verbal abuse, or if you've experienced racism, that you may feel like you're being humiliated when your kid laughs at you, right? Invariably, after a minute or two, the kid would apologize and say, sorry, Mommy. And so I said, do you think maybe he laughed because he's embarrassed or because he's nervous and not because he's stubborn? And as soon as I said that, Mom's shoulders kind of dropped, and she thought, never really thought about that before. And so we talked about ways to center herself during the times when she did need to do a correction or a discipline, that she needed to take a deep breath, remind herself why she's doing the correction. That is, what is she trying to accomplish by doing the discipline, and then to focus on her goal. Now, I think that when you understand where kids are developmentally, it keeps us from misinterpreting their reactions, right? So if we've had a lot of these early childhood traumas, then we naturally, when we think back to those experiences, we may think that person who committed it was a jerk, right? Or that they were mean, or that they were stubborn, or something like that. So when we see those behaviors in our kids, our natural reaction is to put that same label on our kids. And I would just say that toddlers and children are not capable of being mean or stubborn or selfish. It's sort of our interpretation of behavior, but that's not really what kids are doing. So I think that when you see an unwanted behavior in your kid, it's important to focus on the goal. Why are we trying to correct that behavior instead of focusing on the reaction? Now, there's this phrase it's called collaborative problem solving, which is a mental health approach to kids' behavior. And the phrase is, kids do well when they can. All right? So if you start from that framework that if a kid does well when they can, and they're not currently doing well, there's a reason behind why they're not doing well. We may not know what it is yet, but we need to figure it out, right? So if we start with that framework, that kids do well when they can, then that helps us to try to think about how we understand that behavior differently. It's not, again, mean, stubborn, selfish, or other things like that. So again, I'm going to talk about 5 things that I think you can start doing right away. And these are really, to me, the positive parenting principles that I think get you a long way in terms of preventing the effects of your trauma on how you parent your child. The first is to remember self-care. Second, positive reinforcement is at a 5-to-1 ratio. 50 to 100 loving touches a day, time ins, and then talk it out. And I'm going to talk about each of these individually. So the first one, in terms of self-care. Again, I think that parents really do need to spend time focusing on what makes you feel energized, rejuvenated, or recharged, right? And if you can do that just for a few minutes every day to lower your own stress and to feel good about your life, I think that's going to help. Now, if you can, involve your kids in those activities that bring you life, right? Like as a pediatrician, I tell people to do a lot of different things to try to stimulate their kids' development. For example, we talk a lot about reading with your kids every day. Now, reading is not always a natural thing or something that parents are particularly good at or interested in, but if parents can find those few things that they are strong in, that they enjoy doing, like maybe it's cooking with your kid, maybe it's playing music, singing and dancing, right? So find that one thing that brings you joy and bring that activity into your daily life, and even better if you can do that with your kids. And I think, too, that having some self-compassion. We're all human beings, so sometimes our parenting is not exactly ideal or how we would like it to have gone. And I always tell parents it's not how you parent all the time, it's how you parent most of the time, right? So we're going to have moments where things don't go exactly how we want. Be kind to yourself about that. Positive reinforcement at a 5-to-1 ratio. So, positive parenting experts would say that for every one time you have to correct or discipline a child, that you should try to catch them doing something well at least 5 times, right? So for every one time we have to do a negative correction, that we have 5 times that we find them doing something well. And what ends up happening is the more we reinforce the good behaviors, the more the kids are going to want to do those good behaviors so that they stay getting attention from their parents. They will take positive or negative attention from us, but they would prefer the positive, right? So the more that we reinforce the good behavior by giving attention for what we want to see, that helps to increase those good behaviors, and eventually the bad behaviors will drop off. So for every one time you have to correct a child, try to find the 5 times that they're doing something well. I always recommend, too, being super specific about it. If you say good job to a child and, you have seen a particular behavior, but you didn't see what they just did around the corner, they may kind of envelop that into what they're being reinforced for. So be specific. Good job sitting still while I'm on the phone. Good job picking up your toys. Things like that, so that you're being very specific about what you're praising the child for. Now, 50 to 100 loving touches a day. And we think that this loving touches really helps kids to feel safe and secure in their environment. 50 to 100 seems like a lot, right? Now, those can be all kinds of different loving touches. So if you have a 13-year-old boy at home, he's probably not going to be super into hugs and kisses 50 to 100 times a day. So those can be high fives, fist bumps, shoulder rubs, back rubs, things like that. So try to challenge yourself to do 50 to 100 loving touches a day for your child. Time-ins. Now, people have probably heard of the concept of timeouts, which, when I was first in practice, that was kind of sticking kids in a corner and hoping that they calm down eventually, right? Time-ins are sort of the opposite of that. And this, again, is getting back to the idea of giving positive attention for good behaviors. And this comes out of a mental health therapy technique called parent-child interactive therapy, where a parent and a child are on the floor playing together. And if you can do a time in for 5 to 10 minutes a day, that's usually pretty good in terms of getting the behaviors that you want to see. During the time in, the child chooses the behavior or the activity that you're going to do. As a parent, we comment, praise, and describe what the child is doing constantly, but we don't correct, question, or criticize. So this is really about describing what the child is doing, complimenting them on how well they're doing with their coloring or building or whatever it is they're doing, talking about the colors that they've chosen, things like that. But we don't, again, correct, criticize, or direct the activity. If during that time the child does something bad, so this always happens where a toddler will throw a brick, or they're building a tower and then they stomp it to pieces or something like that. If a child does something bad during that particular time in, we just zip it. We say nothing. And what ends up happening is a child is going to want to go back to the behavior that was getting the comments and the attention from their parents. So they'll go back to the good behavior. They'll go back to playing or coloring or building or whatever, and then we start talking as soon as the kids do that. So that, again, reinforces the good behavior. If you see a bad behavior, we just pretend it didn't happen. Don't say anything until they go back to the behavior that they were doing before. And what you find is usually if I ask parents to spend 5 minutes a day doing this, pretty soon it's 20, and then it's 30, because it's actually kind of fun seeing our kids really be alive and doing their creative play. Now, my last piece, I think, is talk it out. What we know about resilience and what helps us to resist stress is really having connection with other human beings, having connection with other people, and having positive, healthy relationships. So, either in your mind or in your notebooks, think about 3 to 5 people that you can talk to about your parenting or about caring for kids, so that when you're feeling a challenge, talk it out with them, right? Find somebody on that list and actually have a conversation with them. And again, the more that you put story to the things that you're dealing with, the less power they're going to have over you. And I can guarantee you that whatever challenge you're having with your kids, somebody else that you know is having that same challenge. So the more, again, we talk it out, the easier it's going to be to deal with. Now, I will also, and this is more a challenge to my profession, and I hate to put all the pressure on parents to do this work for us, but ask your pediatrician about resilience, about early childhood trauma, and how you can do more positive parenting. Now, what I will say is that across the country, 75% of pediatricians are not even aware of the ACE study. All right? So the majority of pediatricians don't know anything about what I just said. All right? 5% of pediatricians are currently screening for ACEs in some fashion in their practice, so not many. That said, Oregon, I have been lecturing to hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pediatricians about this, so you have a better chance here than in most other parts of the country of finding a pediatrician who knows this stuff and can work on it with you. If they don't, ask them to learn. All right. I think that a lot of times pediatricians kind of go through their day. We go through our day, dealing with whatever problem is in front of us. And if somebody isn't asking us for a specific thing, we don't think about it. So be bold and ask your pediatrician to learn this. And if they don't know how, ask them to call the Oregon Pediatric Society, and we'll go train them. Okay. Now, we're going to do one very quick self-regulation activity, if that's okay with everybody, because I think this is one that I do with kids all the time, and generally it works well enough for kids that it's a good technique for parents to have. And we refer to this as orienting, centering, and grounding. So if everybody can just get comfortable in their chair just for a second. Feet on the floor is usually better. First thing I want you to do is think about your favorite color. Okay, so when you have in your mind what your favorite color is, I want you to just look around the room and find all the places where that color exists, right? So for me, it's green. There's some green there. Not a lot of green today. Oh, you're wearing green. Good. Okay. So, yeah, just kind of look around. Okay. Now, second, with your back straight, I want you to close your eyes just for a second, and I want you to take 3 deep breaths. And when you take a deep breath, I want you to breathe in through your nose, hold it for just a second, and then let it out slow. And really, this should engage your belly a little bit. All right, now last thing, I want you to draw your attention to how your butt feels in your seat and how your feet feel on the floor. So really pay attention to how your body feels touching the seat and the floor. And when you're ready, open your eyes. Now, first, in terms of orienting, one of the things that happens when we're stressed generally is that we go out of our mind, right? We lose track of where we are. We start thinking about something else, right? So the first thing when you're stressed out really is to look around and notice your surroundings. That'll pull your attention back into the room. So that's why we have people look at colors. And again, I have kids do this. You can look at colors, shapes, letters. So a kid looking around the room, not only are they getting more aware of their surrounding, but actually stretching your neck will trigger a relaxation response, right? We all know this because when we're stressed, one of the things we do is we kind of, tweak our neck a little bit, and that actually triggers a physiologic response, right? Second thing, the breathing helps us to be centered, right? So this is, again, being aware of our own center. So not having a strong sense of self will make you feel uncentered. So doing that breathing and getting in touch with the muscles of your abdomen will help you to recenter yourself. And then grounded, again, that grounding piece in terms of paying attention to how your bottom and your feet feel in your seat. Draw your attention back into your body. Because again, when we're feeling stressed, we don't feel like we're safe, secure, or relaxed. And so bringing your attention back into your body will help you to feel more grounded again. So I do this all the time with kids, and it's a pretty quick process, right? And it works very well. So do it for yourself. Practice it with your kids as well if they're old enough to know colors and shapes and things like that. And you'll find this is a powerful technique for helping to regulate a kid who's upset. Usually this is right after a conversation about like, hey, you're getting shots today, right? And then the kid's kind of, So we go through this process and it brings them back pretty quick, okay? Now, some apps and programs that promote wellness, some of my personal favorites. Are people familiar with Vroom? It's a great app because it talks about how you stimulate kids' development during everyday activities that you do, right? So when you're changing a diaper, count toes, right? Count fingers. Easy. The kid's already there. They're close enough to you to be able to see what you're doing. When you're feeding your kid, talk about colors and textures, right? I mean, this is what Vroom is about, is really kind of figuring out some of those everyday moments where you can stimulate kids' development by having longer conversations with them than you would naturally do. Headspace is an app that's, and there are a couple of them. There's one for kids 6 and up and one for adults. That's an app that's meant to help track kind of your emotional state and how you're doing on a day-to-day basis. Tactical breathing is just it coaches you through to how to do calm breathing. It's a free app. It just basically goes through that same sort of breathing pattern that we just did. Mind Yeti is for kids 6 to 11 generally, and those are guided meditations that are 3 to 6 minutes long. Schools are using this like crazy to keep kids in classrooms when they're feeling upset or unregulated, and it's a great quick process again for getting kids back in the game. Simply Being is a guided meditation app that I use all the time. It costs $2.99 in the iTunes store. Some free ones, if you look on YouTube and you look up 5-minute, 10-minute, 15-minute, or 20-minute body scan, you'll get some free guided meditations too that I find very helpful. Breathing stars, if you look that up on the internet, you'll get a technique for how to do breathing stars, which is a breathing exercise again for kids. And then again, reading, I think, is an important thing, not only for literacy, but also for kind of bonding and having a time in with your kids. And that's it for my part. Just in time, I was just getting the red, stop talking.